Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces, and those who are joining us for the first time, welcome. My name is Asad Lalji. I'm the CEO of Abbott Learning. Our Motives, Materials, and Makers series began last year as an exploration of architectural vocabulary that has shaped Mumbai's built environment and, by extension, our collective imagination. This series has included Indo-Gothic, Bauhaus, mid-century modern in the first three editions. We now arrive at the fourth episode, which is Indo-Saracenic architecture. Think of the buildings that most people picture when they think of our maximum city. The Gateway of India, standing at the edge of the harbour, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangralaya, the CSMVS, with its intricately detailed facades, and the General Post Office housing the second largest dome in the country. These expressions of Indo-Saracenic architecture are the visual glamour of Mumbai. In Bombay, this style found its most eloquent expression through the work of one man, George Whitted. Consulting architect of the government of Bombay, 1904 to 1926, he completed nearly 100 government projects in the city to shape Bombay that was both imperial and deeply local, including this very own Kavashi Jahangir Hall. Tonight, we have something very special for you. George Whitted's grandson, Ian Whitted, has shared a video reflection with us, along with photographs from his collection that you will soon see. We thank him for his generosity, and we believe that these words will add a rare and meaningful dimension to the conversation that follows. Thwani, can you please have the video?
My name is Ian Whitted, and I live in Edinburgh. George Whitted was my grandfather. I didn't know him. Even my father hardly knew him. He died when my father was only 8. So I didn't grow up with stories about his life or his work. For most of my life, all I really knew was that he was an architect and that he had designed an Indian version of the Arc de Triomphe, called the Gateway of India. It was one of our children, if one of our children was travelling through India, I'd say, "You should go and see it. You might even see my grandfather's name written somewhere." But I didn't think about it very much. It wasn't until much later, 2 years ago, when my wife and I were stopped in Mumbai on our way to Australia, that I began to understand the scale of what he had done. An architect very kindly showed us around the city, not just the gateway, but major public buildings, also offices, hospitals, hotels, private houses. When I saw the list of his works, which he himself had prepared in 1926, I realized how much he had achieved in what was actually quite a short life. What struck me most during that visit was the mixture of styles, this Hindu, Arab, and Georgian, the makings of Indo-Saracenic architecture, and how carefully he had studied and applied them. Georgian, of course, was part of what he had practiced in Edinburgh, but in Mumbai he seems to have absorbed something deeper, adapting his training to a very different cultural and architectural tradition. There was imagination there, but also respect. I remember thinking what an extraordinary opportunity that must have been for a young architect. While so many of his contemporaries were caught up in the devastation of the First World War, he was able to continue working, protected, as many colonial civil servants were, from its immediate horrors. The war shaped the century, surely, but it did not define his story. His life followed a different path, one measured not in battles or deaths, but in stone, arches, domes, rising along the waterfront of a distant city. I still feel rather amazed that the architectural world honours him in this way. His buildings remain part of Mumbai's daily life, used, passed in front of, photographed, argued over and admired, but they have outlived the empire that commissioned many of them, and they belong now just to the city itself. And I am grateful that I've had the chance, even rather late on, to understand something of what he has left behind, not simply as an architect of monuments, but as a young Scotsman who found his life's work far from home, and whose legacy continues quietly and solidly in the streets of Mumbai. So thank you.
You know, a special thank you to Ian for these reflections. Especially, he had a very busy weekend. His son was getting married, so George's great-great-grandson was getting married this weekend. Thank you to Nikhil Mahashur. He was the architect. I don't know if he's here, but he said he was going to come. He was the architect who took him around, and he had introduced us to Ian, and we've been back and forth, and hope we got this video testimonial yesterday, just in time. Just before I go on, I just want to make a plug for our wonderful hosts. A special thank you to Ms. Nidhi Chaudhary, Director of the NGMA, and Shruti Das. You know, the prestigious National Gallery of Modern Art, I was just given this to read, sorry, it's separate script, presents Colors of Swadesh, from Haripura to the Constitution, a landmark exhibition celebrating the legacy of Nandlal Bose, 1982 to 1966, one of the most influential figures in the history of Indian art. The showcase will run for 2 months, from 9th of March to 9th of April. One of the most engaging aspects of this exhibition is the integration of contemporary digital interpretation along with historic works. So you must go check out the show. It's up here in the dome. It's quite charming, that place. So thank you, Nidhi ji and Shruti. I think you're here somewhere. And also to Ms. Katyani Agarwal, the convener of Intact's Greater Mumbai chapter, for partnering with us on this series. And this brings me to the task at hand. Avid Learning, in collaboration with the National Gallery of Modern Art, Mumbai, and Intact's Greater Mumbai chapter, present Motifs, Materials, and Makers of Indo-Saracenic Architecture. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers on stage. I'm not going to read bios because they were all emailed to you. Professor of Architecture, Smita Dalvi. Conservation Architect, Abha Narayan Lamba. Vice Chairman and Managing Director, Maharashtra Airport Development Company, Swati Pandey. And our moderator for this series, Assistant Professor, Architecture and Urban Conservation Program, Kavya Sanaya Vandrewala. Look forward to a very exciting conversation, and over to you, Sanaya. And she's going to share some of Witit's original images that you'll perhaps have not seen before.
Thank you, Asad. Indo-Saracenic architecture emerged in the late 19th and earlier 20th century India at a moment when architecture became a potent instrument of cultural and political expression. Defined by the combination of European planning principles and with elements drawn from Mughals, Rajput, and Sultanate period and other pre-colonial traditions, the style has often been described as a hybrid. Yet this synthesis extended beyond aesthetics. Within the colonial context, built form became a strategic medium through which authority was asserted and legitimized. By selectively appropriating and reframing India's architectural past, the imperial power projected itself as both modern and historically continuous. This style was shaped by contemporary intellectual and artistic currents that encourage renewed engagement with craft traditions and ornamental vocabularies. Architectural elements such as domes, chhatris, arches, and intricate stonework were translated into monumental civic forms suited to courts, museums, universities, railway stations, and administrative offices. These buildings function not only as infrastructure, but also as symbolic statements communicating stability, efficiency, and permanence. Through scale, materiality, and ornamentation, architecture mediated the relationship between state and citizen, embedding governance within a culturally resonant visual language. Patronage also played a critical role in consolidating and disseminating this style. While colonial authorities employed it to temper the image of imperial dominance, princely states adopted and adapted it to express modernity and regional identity. Local materials, climate responses, and artisanal practices shaped its regional variations, allowing it to circulate widely while maintaining a coherent architectural identity. In contemporary India, Indo-Saracenic architecture occupies an ambivalent yet significant position. Its origins are tied to imperial politics, Yet, its presence has become an integral part of the urban character of many cities. Interpreting this legacy requires balancing critical awareness of its ideological foundations with recognition of its aesthetic and historical value, revealing architecture's enduring capacity to shape memory, identity, and public space. I would now like to welcome each of the panelists to give a short presentation, starting with Smita, who will speak about introduction to Indo-Saracenic in the country, followed by Abha Narayan Lamba, who would focus on Indo-Saracenic within the city of Mumbai, and lastly, Swati Pandey, who will talk about her project, the General Post Office. Smita.
Good evening to all of you. We have gathered here to talk about Indo-Saracenic architecture. And as we know, it became a preferred style for buildings in the late 19th century after the Indian colony was placed directly under the British imperial rule. In the presidency towns, and specifically in Madras and in Bombay, we see a promotion of this style in the buildings of the Raj. But that was not all. A number of Maharajas of the princely states also patronized it. Architects like Robert Chisholm, Charles Mant, and Henry Irwin were hired by them to build their palaces, colleges, schools, etc. The style itself can best be described as an eclectic mixing of architectural elements such as domes and arches, chhatris and chhajjas, brackets and jalis, turrets and pinnacles, and so on, derived primarily from various historical Indo-Islamic buildings, and hence the name of the style. It is interesting to know about the antecedents of this sudden burst of inspiration for the Raj and for the British architects. One of them, Sir Samuel Swinton Jacob, he compiled what is very famously known as the Jaipur Portfolio, which is a 6-volume collection of documentation of architectural details taken from various historical buildings of the Mughals and the Rajputs. This portfolio became like a pattern book for details that can be used in any combination by the architects and the craftsmen. He himself used it for his museum building at Jaipur that you saw in the last slide. The other major source was the Archaeological Survey of India, which was established in 1861. But by 1880s, it launched itself into a massive drive of documentation of India's architectural past in the form of measured drawings of buildings, their elements, and decorative features. They were particularly fascinated by Mughal architecture, but also by 2 other locations, namely the Adil Shahis of Bijapur and Gujarat Sultanate of Ahmedabad. I would mention Henry Cousins, a superintendent with the ASI, and his books on Bijapur, which included drawings and photographs of buildings such as Gol Gumbaj, Ibrahim Roza, and Mitar Mahal, which had a great impact on the buildings that followed in Indo-Saracenic architecture. But his book also, by the way, included kind of works from another ASI publication, and that is the Technical Art Series of 1890, which contained several measured drawings of decorative details from Hindu and Islamic architecture in India. So how these documentations inspired translations into motifs of Indo-Saracenic buildings is something that we have to understand. And you can, on this slide, you can see here the drawings of, some of the drawings of ornamental brackets and parapets from Bijapur, from the Technical Art Series of 1890 that I told you about. Then you can see the photograph of an exquisite balcony at Ibrahim Roza in Bijapur, the original building, right? And on its side, a measured drawing done at Sir J.J. School of Art. On the right, then we can see an attempt at translation and adaptations on the CSMVS museum building over here in Bombay. So the various acts of documentation acted as mediation between the original buildings and its adaptation into Indo-Saracenic. So likewise, we can trace antecedents of motifs in Indo-Saracenic buildings around India to various historical periods, Hindu, Islamic, and also, of course, they were overlaid on a lot of Neo-Gothic details as well. So behind the genesis and synthesis of this hybrid style of building lie several enabling factors alongside the intentions of the British Raj in embracing it. We hope to discuss these as we go along today. Thank you.
So it's motifs, materials, and I think when I'm looking at what was the shift, to begin with, we're talking of British colonial architecture in India. So that begs the question, why did the Indo-Saracenic style spring up in the first place? And for that, we need to go back to the first generation of buildings that the British built in India. And we all know that they first would have begun in the presidencies, so Bombay, Madras, Calcutta. But initially, in the first few decades, what is the messaging that architecture of the British is supposed to give out? It's the messaging that we are a superior race, we are a great civilization, and we are bringing to the colonies something great. And I've always maintained that architecture is a very political statement. So if you look at architecture and do not put politics in the same bucket, you are never able to understand the psychology of those buildings. And for me, that's probably the most interesting aspect of architectural history. So when you see a bunch of British merchants, sailors, profiteers, etc., archaeologists, historians, whatever this motley bunch of the early East India Company people were, and when they started building the earliest buildings, what would they build in? And the answer to that is the Hellenic classical style. Because even though England was not in Greece, to them, the greatest ultimate zenith of the European or the white man's architectural, civilizational zenith was represented by the Parthenon and the Pantheon then. So either the Greeks or the Romans. And that was what they were bringing as their visiting card to India, that this is the greatness of our culture and civilization. And therefore, the first few decades of British buildings built in India are largely and unquestionably with Doric columns, Tuscan columns, Corinthian columns, Ionic columns. And all this really came out of a toolbox of catalogues. Again, in Europe, they were very, very popular. They were catalogues. So if you were building an early church, you would, whether it's looking at Scots Kirk in Bombay or in Chennai or in anywhere else in India, they would pluck a typical church model from England and place it there, because these were mostly army engineers who were building and not really professional architects in the first instance. So this is the kind of architecture that came along in the first few decades. But then it's the British eclecticism and debate of style that led us then to be able to in parallel to the wars and the various political developments across Calcutta and the end of the Mughals and everything else, the watershed is 1857. And that is when, with the exile of the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, the British realized that they are here to stay. So again, the shift was from either a trading company or people who were opening up a shop in various states of India to even in early Hyderabad, if you see the Residency or the town hall in Calcutta and Bombay, from that very, very European classical architecture. They realized in 1857 that now they are the political emperors of Hindustan. And that makes a strong psychological shift. And two things happened at this time. One is that Victoria and Queen Victoria was announced as the Empress of Hindustan, and therefore Hindustan was now their legacy and something that they were going to be putting roots into. And the second thing that happened is that with the exile of Bahadur Shah Zafar, it begged the question, what is going to fill that vacuum? So if the Indians were subjected apparently by the Mughals for so many centuries, if that vacuum of power and politics has got to be filled, by whom? And certainly neoclassical Hellenic buildings were not going to fill that political vacuum, and that required innovation in architecture to come up with a new model. And that's when we see, like it's been mentioned before, the Archaeological Survey of India delving into India's history. You look at the Jaipur portfolio and many others. So what really happens with even William Emerson strongly advocating around that time that the British should follow the examples of the Mughal, who had, quote, seized upon the art indigenous to the countries they conquered, adapting it to suit their own needs and ideas. And really what happened was a European building, which was decidedly European in plan, in function, would be clad by an Indian costume to try and make it look Indian. And that really is the beginning of the style, of the Indo-Saracenic style. So we then have various proponents of these styles coming up in different parts of the subcontinent. So we have Robert Chisholm, who begins in Chennai, but then he goes on to Baroda, and you see his footprint across a much larger swath of India. And he begins with Chennai and the Madras presidency with some amazing examples from the Senate Hall. And what they're doing, as was mentioned, is borrowing materials and borrowing elements. So the dome gets placed, the finial gets placed, the idea of the Moorish arch, because initially the idea is even Indo-Saracenic is a misnomer because we are not Saracens. But the idea that anything outside of Europe and sort of exotic was under the realm of Moorish, Saracenic, and these get pasted across. So here the polychromatic arch form is maybe closer to Morocco than it is to India, but it was just exotic and then gets pasted on. So we have William Emerson's Muir College in Allahabad, which is one of the early ones in 1873, Robert Chisholm's Madras University Senate House in 1870s, Chisholm's Chepauk Palace, which really held its sway over the entire 20th century. And we have these, and we have various other patrons, whether it's Maharajas or others, who then start commissioning these architects. However, so this is what we see. We have Brassington and Henry Irving building the Madras High Court. It's really a whole collection of cupolas, domes, arches. But if you see the plan of the building, the plan is purely a European functional plan. So from the porte cochere to the planning, everything else is European. Is just clad with this cover to make it look as Indian as it's possible. And then when we see Jaipur, we see, I'm sorry, that's a misnomer, that's not Robert Chisholm. And then when we see stone coming in, we discuss the Jaipur portfolio and we see the stonework, the jalis, all that are part of the Jaipur portfolio placed on both Albert Hall and City Palace. And we have the Nizams of Hyderabad then commissioning Vincent Esch to design all these amazing public buildings across the river Musi in Hyderabad. So from the Osmania General Hospital to the High Court and various other colleges, we start seeing these grand buildings with these grand facades, and most of them come up with in this picturesque sort of a setting, fronting the river and making a strong political statement of being there and being part of the city, and yet sort of trying to both stand out and merge within the city as always. And so then these domes acquire a distinctly Sultanate shape and form here, and even the mehrabs and the pishtaks become a part of a very European plan. And we see J.H. Horniman and Chaube Mukta Prasad doing the Lucknow railway station. So in terms of what's really happening then is that public architecture that's commissioned in the period, distinctly by rulers then in the turn of the century. So here, if we take a pause and discuss what's happening to Bombay around that time. So while Calcutta, the first presidency, is distinctly classical and it stayed neoclassical till its dying day. What Bombay did was, from the 60s, there was a change in the architectural style, and that has to do with Bombay's own history. Because here we are talking about fort, which is a dense fort. It's Portuguese by creation. It has got narrow alleys, and it's surrounded by a moat. And then in 1860s, you have the need to demolish the fort walls, and that's due to a plague outbreak, nothing majorly political. And when that happens and the walls have to be torn down and the moat has to be filled, so we are actually standing at the moat. This building and the entire row of buildings along MG Road and are literally standing on the moat. So what happens with that is the walls get torn down, the moat gets filled, and James Trubshaw, an architect of Bombay, gets appointed to a committee that is then going to decide what the architecture of Bombay is. And from these narrow alleys with corners, and the minute you walk into Kala Ghoda and the minute you cross Rhythm House and move into these meandering narrow alleys, you realize you're in the fort because there are no large footprint. But just outside it, when you see the Bombay High Court, the Elphinstone College, David Sassoon, and wherever we are, this entire swath, that is where the moat gets filled in and a new landmass is acquired for the expansion of the city. And these are cut into large parcels of land and assigned to various uses under the Trubshaw Committee. And Trubshaw distinctly, every architect has a certain leaning or some favorites, and Trubshaw was distinctly leaning towards a Gothic city. So this is also, again, if we match it politically, this is happening when Victoria is queen, and what's happening in England at that time, because Calcutta is definitely older, but in the 1860s, 1870s, what's ruling and what's in style and vogue architecturally in England is what Bombay has to follow through with. So you're just copying whatever is the most fashionable outfit in London, whatever is the most fashionable building in London. And at that point, there are two people, Pugin and Ruskin in England, who are advocating within England a need for change of style. And what they're saying is, for too long, we've been stuck with copying Greek and Roman columns, and we've been stuck with this whole Eurocentric neoclassicism, and we need a British style and English style of our own. So while what we're seeing a political churning in India, there's a political churning or politico-architectural churning in England as well. And the mothership is realizing that they need to start advocating an architectural style that is English and not continental Europe. And they then find that the Gothic cathedrals and the Gothic architecture of England, which goes back to the 11th and the 12th and the 13th century, is really English, and they begin then lobbying for an English style which is Gothic. So while Gothic is raging in London, in Bombay, they just decide we'll follow through because we are the second city of sorry, next please. And that is what happens here. We have the Triumphal Arch, then gets wrapped up in the Indo-Saracenic with Gujarat as the main. Here you can actually see which Sultanate monuments from Gujarat come in. And we've just discussed the CSMVS Museum, the Prince of Wales, and then all the other buildings. But I would not put Victoria Terminus and BMC and those in this bucket, because for me they are definitely Gothic and Indo-Gothic for sure. But then the distinction would be that this turn of the century, early 20th century buildings in Bombay, by the time it goes around the country, when it comes back to Bombay, then that becomes purely Islamic, Sultanate, Gujarat Sultanate, Bijapur and all that. Next. And so that then becomes the next point of what happens with Delhi. And when Lutyens is appointed to design Delhi, he actually sketched in a letter a sketch of the viceroy wearing a burqa. And he said, that is what Indo-Saracenic architecture will look like if Delhi is made Indo-Saracenic. And he makes a pitch for going back to neoclassicism. But then, because of the viceroy's arm twisting, he decides then to do something which is in the middle, somewhere early Deco, somewhere late Edwardian, neoclassical, and a little bit of the Indo-Saracenic. Thank you.
Namaskar and good evening. I think that Abha and Smitaji have done the job, easier for me. So I did not bring a presentation because I thought that for a person who has been married to the Department of Post for the past 28 years and Mumbai GPO was my home of passion, let me show you what Mumbai GPO or actually Indo-Saracenic style looks from inside in all its grandeur. The movie, please. Well, that was just the West Wing being restored, and that took me about 2 years. So let me just, for me, it's a personal journey. I'm not an academic. And today I come with another, misnomer of being the airport person because I'm a civil servant. So from the Indo-Saracenic, I designed very modern, ultra-modern airports. But let's talk about GPO. This, for me, the father of Mumbai GPO was, of course, John Begg. He brought in with him a lot of, wicked ideas, which he carried actually from Scotland. and Mr. Whitted, George Whitted, was his apprentice. John Begg used to be the imperial architect in South Africa, and after the Boer War, he had retired to Scotland. Commissioned again in 1901, he came back to Mumbai, and as Abha said, that it was the rulers now who were paying up, and you saw it was Mumbai GPO. It started construction in 1904, and we opened our doors in 1913. The entire cost of Mumbai GPO in those days was 18,09,000. Please go back. Now what? And it's exactly, Abha, you took a lot of my sayings, so we'll, good and bad. Because it was a very British architecture. The layout inside Mumbai GPO is very British. Grandeur, very true to form. So I would say it's a revival Gothic, as she puts it, with a cladding of Indo-Saracenic. And when I say a cladding of Indo-Saracenic, quite rightly so, it has the second largest freestanding dome of the country, inspired from Gol Gumbaj, Bijapur. So that is the largest freestanding dome, and this is about 65 feet in dia. And the entire length of the GPOs, as it stands, is 119 meters. And 1,20,000 square feet carpet, standing right there. Now, Mumbai GPO also had the distinction of being, it opened as a post office, and why did the British choose? And like she said, that this is a part of the moat. Mumbai GPO was, I think, it stood in front of the most important gate of Mumbai. Mumbai was a fortified walled city with 3 gates. Mumbai GPO stood in front of. Any ideas which gate? Because you would see why it was in front of that particular gate. The Bazaar Gate. The Bazaar Gate, classically Mumbai was a tradesperson city. It was not a political city. It was a city of trade and commerce. It still remains a city of trade and commerce. That's the character of Mumbai. Bazaar Gate. Because GPO epitomized the wealth of the Raj. BMC epitomized the political power. Railways epitomize the mechanical, the engine, the industrial success, and GPO being the biggest bank. Even today, somebody asked me, I think, Smita, you asked me that why do you not have programs inside Mumbai GPO? Mumbai GPO has loads and loads of cash each day, every day. It had in the British Raj also, coming to the fact that the Bazaar Gate is where you had tradespeople working and depositing their money in Mumbai GPO every evening. Because by that time, 1857 revolt also set up the postal system by Lord Dalhousie. And the Post Office Savings Bank, which is the oldest bank of this country, had been set up as something that protected the money of the Brits. Not about Post Office Savings Bank today is a common man's bank. So that was what GPO had to symbolize, the grandeur of the Raj. And because it was the money, the money storage vault of the Raj, we had, I am told, because I could never unearth that, constant road laying has, I believe you were also part of wanting to look at the tunnels of GPO. That is what, but I would like to tell you that I never found those tunnels. And I did a lot of hunting because now they look like drains. If they were tunnels, they've collapsed today. But I'm told that there were 3 tunnels to the Mint, the Reserve Bank area, and then to the gateway. Because that is where you could take the money out and ship it off. Because remember, the Raj was not about beautifying India. It was about cultural diplomacy. Why did these buildings look so Indian? It was just a cladding. You had to appease the masses because after the revolt, a sense of nationalism had come in. And 1903, you had, Gokhles and Gandhis, there was a political movement about what was Indian. So the Raj, of course, had to clad itself in a sari that looked Indian enough. But let me tell you that the core of GPO internally still stays revival Gothic, like the materials. let's talk about the materials and then I'll come to each revival Gothic element. The materials were Indian because you had, number one, the Kurla basalt, the dark stone that you see in most buildings, the Kurla basalt. You also had the yellow, soft Malad stone, and you had the white Dhrangdhara stone that came from Gujarat. Now, these three colors played something that was very, very Victorian, right? They were polychromatic. Our buildings were not polychromatic. If you built a red fort, it was red. Then you build, so we never played with colors. So GPO, even though it looked Indian, was actually so, and you have the Tudor gateway, which of course they say it's, the Bengal Dhar, but I find the gateway very Tudor. Then you had the continuous arches with a colonnade facade. Again, very, very revival Gothic. The spires is when they built up the minarets. So you had these spires and turrets. We have 4 turrets, octagonal turrets. The planning was British. But to cover that up, the cladding became the chhatris, the Jaipur-style chhatris and the finials. In fact, Mumbai GPO has the largest and the longest finial that adorns the central dome. It was copper clad to start with. And when I found GPO in 2018, it was a rotten wooden structure, the finial. It was rotting. And you would have seen me atop 119 meters up in a rope ladder up, checking to see that what do we do. So when we restored, the finial itself cost me about 15 lakhs. We made it out of copper. We did not want to make any kind of compromise to what it was originally there. The tiles were original Minton tiles of Mumbai GPO. We could not get that. Yeah, I'll just finish it. So when we talk about Indo-Saracenic, I think you must bear this in mind, and that's where I resonate with Abha. It was the Raj playing a trick to make us our buildings look Indian, because now they were the new kingdom. But mind you, it also brought in a lot of European civil engineering. Mumbai GPO was one of the earliest buildings that uses iron cladding and iron, as a material of strength. In fact, when it was built, it was said to be the most technologically civil engineering advanced structure of Mumbai in those days. Thank you, and we'll hear a little more about that later.
Thank you so much to all the panelists for their lovely presentations. A lot of context has already been set up, so I'm just going to skip through all that introduction that we were going to discuss. I'm sure you've heard about, the transition from the earlier classical styles moving into the Indo-Saracenic. So let's just begin with Smita about what was this appropriating and rebuilding of the Indian architectural heritage, and how did this process influence India's evolving conception of its own history? Because they were clearly creating a narrative of, that they are the predecessors of of what comes after Mughal in India. So this whole idea of rebuilding India's new identity, if you could just elaborate a little bit more on that?
Right. So, in order to understand the architecture of the British Raj in India, we need to understand 2 concepts. One is their evolving notions of authority and how they chose to project it over the different time. And the other was a certain projection of their own self. Let's talk about the first one, that is the changing notions of authority. So once through East India Company, when the Raj establishes itself here in India, in 18th century, and early 19th century, we see what they bring to India as architecture style is what is popular in the home country, that is in London and in England, and that was the classical revival styles. And through that, they project their authority onto the colonial, the colonized state. Now that these ideas kind of change in the middle of 19th century, when the ideas about a national style of architecture back home for them, right, in England, itself changed. So there was this great debate about architectural style in England as to what is our national style. And through the writings of people like John Ruskin and other philosophers, the verdict was towards Neo-Gothic, because that was considered to be more English, more national as compared to the European neoclassical style. Now, moment that happens, that particular notion also immediately travels to the colony. And in Bombay, which was the Oops Primadi Indis, the first city of the empire, immediately we see a kind of implications of that, and the buildings of the university, the railway station, and other things that come up in Neo-Gothic. And then there is a third kind of a change that happens, mainly brought about by the mutiny of 1857. Now, the mutiny of 1857 and in its aftermath, the British realized that they went terribly wrong in understanding the people of the colony. And not only, of course, the company was dissolved and the colony was brought directly under the rule of the British Parliament, and therefore the Queen of England became the Empress of India. Not only that, but here to rectify the error of not properly having understood the people of this vast country, they embarked upon a large-scale project of documentation. Documentation of what? Documentation of all kinds of things. Besides the survey of India and all the geographical survey that takes place in the country, there were documentations through photography and other mediums of people of India, the customs of India, the lands of India. All right, and in this context, we must view the setting up of Archaeological Survey of India, which happened in 1861, and very soon the mandate of Archaeological Survey of India became to, I have kind of written it down over here, yeah, a mandate to survey, record, and describe ancient structures. All right, so that's how a large-scale documentation of historical architecture of India kind of became available as a source, right? Now, again, let me put this into another set of perspective. Is that once India became a direct colony under the British Empire, the people, the administrators over here were required to file annual reports. The reports were called Material and Moral Progress of India. All right? So when we say that that number of institutions that were set up and built in Neo-Gothic or Indo-Saracenic styles, these institutions like railway stations, universities, colleges, post offices, etc., were also a part and parcel of the moral progress, the kind of modernizing of this particular country, kind of bringing civilization to this country, right? And the material progress, of course, is through infrastructure that is being built. So we must understand that there are these complex ideas at work as to why the British now kind of, or the Raj kind of thinks that, let's kind of again change the track, because either neoclassical or Gothic revival is not going to cut the cake, because that is going to be viewed as foreign. And if we want to be seen as indigenous rulers, as legitimate successors of the Mughals, then we should kind of build in styles that are local. And what facilitates this is this large-scale documentation that I showed a few examples of that. It facilitates it. It became like all the various types of documentations, not just Jaipur portfolio, acted as pattern books which became handy to the architects and the craftsmen who were involved in it. The second idea is, of course, the projection of the self, how they want to be viewed by the purpose. So they were very, very conscious of the perception, how they are going to be viewed. And they want to be viewed as the new Mughals. So that's why large reliance on Indo-Islamic styles of architecture that kind of comes into the mixture that we call Indo-Saracenic architecture.
Thank you. Abhay, you briefly spoke about the styles being practiced within the princely states. And of course, we see a large spread and legitimization of this style across India because of the princely states. But that also meant that they had to be adapted towards regional context. If you could elaborate a little bit on that, because we are talking about a style which has to be recognized, yet cohesive to its local context.
So what's happening in all these presidency cities is that the infrastructure, the high courts, the universities are directly under the British government. And even though in Bombay, most of them have been co-funded, if not entirely funded, by Parsi, Gujarati merchants and philanthropists. So, I mean, we can't even say that was an act of government. But what was then happening at that point is when you see more than 500, 600 independent rulers looking after their principalities, it needs to trickle down. So whether it's a smaller kacheri in Gwalior or it is, a smaller college in another princely state, that responsibility of building that infrastructure then was upon these rulers. And each one of them would very often commission a British architect, depending on how much, the wealth and stature of that principality or that kingdom. And then they would adapt with local materials. So if you had the Maharaja of Patiala, who was a very rich royal at that time, and Patiala was one of the wealthiest states, they would, of course, look back into Sikh architecture, and because they would also claim their lineage from the Bhati Rajputs, they would also appropriate as well some amount of Rajasthani architecture. And interestingly enough, so in all these states, whether it's the Nizams of Hyderabad building all these great, because the Nizams too were the richest in a sense, they would get a Vincent Esch to do the buildings then in the style which is closer to the Qutub Shahi or the Asif Jahi, and they would pull elements and pluck elements from there. And you would see the same whether you were looking at Travancore or you were looking at north or east. Cooch Behar comes up with that. And also something very interesting is around this period they're all commissioning grand palaces for themselves. So while the original Maharajas and the original rulers were living in the forts. They were all up there in the forts, narrow, again, very high, difficult to get to, small rooms because the span of stone slabs would only, or wooden beams would only allow you that span. So even though we have this romantic version of the Mughal Darbar or a Maharaja having these huge halls, they really were not possible because they were building based on the size of the logs available or the stone slabs. But then all of a sudden they realized that, okay, the Prince of Wales is visiting and we would want to invite him to our principality, and there's no place no way he's going to come and stay up in the fort when there's no WCs and there's no plumbing. And they wanted then to upgrade. So they all started commissioning these huge palatial bungalows, not bungalows, but really huge palaces outside the confines of the fort. So the Scindias built the Jaivilas Palace with an Italian architect, but outside. The Holkars built theirs. So each one of them then had a fort or a city palace, and even the Patialas, they built these. And then these European architects were commissioned to build these grand palaces, very much like the estates, the country houses that the British were building at that time. And that's when these regional nuances come into place. So that's really what's happening. Again, the bunch of architects is still all European, but they're plucking local materials and architectural elements.
As we've seen and we've discussed, like most of these commissions were public institution, and of course GPO will definitely feature on the top of the list. Swati, GPO was designed to signal efficiency, stability, and trust. How do you think Indo-Saracenic buildings shape citizens' relationship with these civic institutions? And in what ways does architecture continue to influence institutional identity and public confidence?
I think more than efficiency, GPO was about grandeur. You know, GPO, if you see, the first GPO was Kolkata GPO. It was very Victorian, and it was again about grandeur. So grandeur came for the Raj first, because GPO also was the economic power, like I said. And economic power is often that makes a ruler, right? So architecture is a defining moment to any monument about what it stands for. So what the palaces signified exactly that, right? When you make big palaces, you said that you have the money power and you have the power in general. So public institutions define the power of the Raj. And that is exactly why the Brits, made the GPO into this huge, spacious, if you see the insides of the GPO, I do not know how many of you, because people tell me that what is the relevance of posts anymore. Like I said, it used to be a lot more relevant as a bank than even today as a bank. So that is what for me was what it signified for the Raj. It was something to show that we are the new emperors, like Smita says, and for the people to be having a wow moment that this is the money power of the Brits. And it had 100 counters, 100 plus counters when it opened in 1914. That is what people remember the GPO for.
So since we are talking about buildings in Bombay, GPO being one of them, and we are looking at them kind of to contribute towards, the identity of the city as the Raj had kind of imagined it. Smita, do you think that it is just an administrative tool or a symbolic monument, or they are instruments for the empire, or were they also built with some sort of understanding of an aspirational public landmark? Because like Abha said, a lot of things in Bombay were built with contributions of the citizens of the city, and not just by the Raj themselves.
Right. So I think we must understand and acknowledge that the various forces were coming together, not just one. So all right, yes, it is true that the British Raj kind of chose public architecture and the style for public architecture as a means, as a tool to project his authority as the indigenous rulers of kind of legitimate kind of lineage of successors. That is true. However, we have to really ask ourselves that were the architects simply the instruments? Were they just taking orders as to, tell me how to build, and then they were building? It is not exactly so. So, for example, say William Emerson, when this discussion and debates were happening as to which style in which we should build, right? He very clearly said that for a country like India, neo-Gothic is clearly an alien style, and it is not really suitable for India. However, Mughal architecture he found as very suitable a model to get inspired for to build in India, because he says that in Mughal architecture he sees a synthesis of Hindu and Islamic architectural traditions. So Emerson clearly was a great admirer of Mughal architecture, and as we have seen, Archaeological Survey of India, the various superintendents and the people working over there, the historians, they were besides the Mughal architecture, Mughal architectural features which were then adapted into Rajput palaces, etc. So that whole combination that we see in Jaipur portfolio. But besides that, people who were working in Archaeological Survey of India and the historians, they were also greatly enamored by Bijapur and Ahmedabad style. Again, but so they are different. Then there are different Islamic styles here in India than the Mughal. Islamic architecture in India is not just Mughal. Right, and so suddenly architecture of Bijapur kind of was brought into a lot of limelight because of that, and architects kind of chose to build with that. So John Begg, when he is kind of preparing his ideas about the GPO, right? So definitely, I think these things must have come to. So there's admiration for these styles is also the other side of the coin that we should include. And then we have to also ask ourselves is why did the Maharajas of these princely states what was their mandate in choosing Indo-Saracenic as a style, as patrons? I leave you with that question, and maybe we can answer that. What were their motives?
Since we're talking about architects and we have discussed and seen videos about George Whitted, two of his best works are in the city, right? The CSMVS Museum, the Gateway of India. Not just his role, but even architects as today, many of us are here. Do you think these buildings negotiate ethics and power politics through architectural form and symbolism?
Oh, there's a lot of negotiation of ethics and politics, especially in the Prince of Wales Museum. I don't know how many of you know, but when I was working on the building, we were researching the history. And the Prince of Wales Museum, or the CSMVS Museum, is designed to a competition winning entry, because there was a public competition inviting architects from India and abroad to design the new museum. And what's really interesting is that the building that we see today, if you look at that building and then you look at the GPO, it looks like a baby of GPO because it has exactly the same dome. It has exactly the same key gallery, the central rotunda. It has exactly the same Bengaldhar roof, exactly the same brackets and chhatris. And it was not the winning design competition. So imagine if you're talking about Mumbai today, and if there were a design competition, which was international, but the architect who won the competition was not given the job. And that makes you wonder that, okay, is there something more? And I'm just going to leave you with the facts and not my assumptions. Whitted was a protege of Begg. Begg met Whitted at a railway station when he arrived in India and took him under his wing. Whitted designed the building of which he was designing for the museum, literally like a carbon copy of his master's. And the best thing is that the master was sitting in the jury. So, so the best compliment one can get as a juror is that somebody is so besotted by his style of architecture that he's made a little copy of the same. And even though Whitted's entry was not judged the best design entry, Begg decided that he will become the architect by saying, though this entry, whichever is the winning entry, is all very beautiful, it is impractical for India and it's going to be very costly. And therefore, my best friend, Begg, gets the project. So there's a lot of that happening in early 20th century India. And then, of course, Whitted goes on to design the Gateway of India, And it's so funny because I've sort of followed his projects, and we're currently working on restoring the Gateway of India. But also when you mention Emerson, though Emerson again at that time is making these public announcements that Mughal architecture and Indo-Saracenic is the only way to go. But then you think of which are his two most famous buildings. One is the grandly Victorian Gothic and the unabashedly Victorian Gothic Crawford Market, and as the other is the unabashedly European Victoria Memorial in Calcutta. And he doesn't go around then making them Indo-Saracenic, even though he announces that Indo-Saracenic and the Mughal style are the best. So it's interesting to see the politics that's happening in the profession as well in the early 20th century, that they're all making public statements, but not really following through probably in their own design.
Thank you. That's what I've always been, you know. Tom-tomming, Mumbai GPU.
I mean, in our discussion and even through presentations, we've seen that the legacy of Indo-Saracenic is quite complex, layered, and continually evolving. Most of these buildings are, or rather all of these buildings, we consider heritage, and in that some sense becomes shared heritage because of its history. So if you're looking at, say, institutional stewardship, which kind of acts as a bridge between memory and modernity, permanence and transformation that these buildings are going through. Their influence is to be interpreted with critical insight, ethical responsibility, and some sensitivity to the change that they are going through. This is a question for all three of you, because in various capacities you have been engaged with these buildings. If we are looking at institutional stewardship, should it truly ensure something that is going to survive, enhance, and evolve? Because we're saying that it's shared heritage, then what role does this, or what should be the role of institutional stewardship? And I don't just mean in terms of, institution when it comes to GPO, which are, say, in that sense, one of the primary stakeholders, but even as conservation architects or society at large or academicians or people engaged using with this building. I mean institutional stewardship in that whole large sense. Any of you can go.
This is a very poignant question, because more than the academics of it, let me tell you that when you work in a building that is falling apart, that from 1914 did not see a major repair, and that you are housed with two other great buildings called the Chhatrapati, the railway station, and the BMC building, and you are one of those broken buildings that everybody looks and tells that, oh, you've seen better days. Then comes the most important part of what role do you play in its heritage? Because remember, this is today the heritage of this city. It is not an Indo-Saracenic building of yesteryears. So anecdotal, please, I would say, because for me, a lot of things is anecdotal. I walked into Mumbai GPU in 2018, and within a month, I had this complaint that a chunk of the ceiling of the postman's hall has fallen down, right? And then I rushed, and I saw not only one chunk, at least 30 chunks from the building was out. There was foliage and, vegetation all over. Out of your 16 minarets, I don't think even one stood tall. There were no finials. The main finial was gone. And the dome, the main dome, there was a crack from within. Inside, 3/4 of the dome was gone. And that was what we were working with. So when you talk about heritage and for the city, the insiders itself were not even aware of the heritage. That it was our home. It was something that, you came working, and most of us worked more than 12 hours a day, because working in a post office is not easy job. A lot of irate customers, for one. I'm sure a lot of you have complaints about the post, and a lot of long queues among older citizens. That is the time when you realize that, hey, I must halt this demise of this great, not in the great building here, the institution itself, right? When you're talking about the grandiose, because for me, GPO was something that was grand. The Raj wanted to make something different. And John Begg, thank you, Abha, because I've always told, when I started the restoration, I did not find its blueprint. Because when I asked that where do we find the blueprint, and people told me Abha Lamba would have. Then somebody said, no, I don't think she has. You know, you worked before me with Abha Singh, I believe. So I came much later. We had to actually mail to the Victoria and Albert Museum to ask whether you have GPO's blueprint. They said, no, we do not have. But you know what? You are the mother lord, the OG as Asad says, but why do you not take the Chhatrapati Sangrahalay's blueprint? Because that is a copy of yours. And exactly, that is the truth. And in fact, the Brits did not get how to make the central dome all right, because this was, Turkish architecture and Mughal architecture. So the master was Mimar Sinan, of course, of all these great domes. So the GPO dome was not even a perfect dome. It was a dome that was propped by 4 small rooms because they could never get the structure of the dome correct. And one of those rooms and they were sealed, right? And you had so much of seepage that the dome had become crooked. And it is by years of staying crooked, the dome had become it was a cracked dome. So when you talk about giving back to the institutions, of course we have a duty towards it. The people working inside more so. It is not the conservational architects, the heritage restorers, or the academics who are responsible. It is people who breathe the building. The pride, it's our pride. It's what we defines us as people also. And from the government, when you realize that who are commissioning these jobs today, it's the government commissioning, right? And why can't the government do itself good? So for me, that is the most important question, that beyond heritage conservation architects, of course they have the master's view. It is within the system that must wake up, that must realize that it is time maybe to not only give back, but to keep that history intact. Because history, you cannot obliterate history. The past is gone. You have to walk with that story and bring it a modern outlook. And there comes the modernism. Because we did not, though we had lifts, and GPO is not a very old provenance structure, but we had to get computer lines. And let me talk about, very, very fun facts about GPO. Because the dome is a hollow dome, acoustics, if you whisper in the central hall, rotunda, you can hear loud and clear. Given it's a Sunday, because we don't want Bombay's population inside, right? Mumbai's population. You also have secret drain pipelines within the stone to drain off the excess water. So it was also specific to the monsoons of Mumbai. The pattern of the central hall, if you see, is a checkered pattern, which is not Indian at all. It's a checkered pattern. So, lots of things. And within the rafters of the GPO, the internal arches, there are some postal symbology. There are envelopes and postal horns. So next time you're in GPO, please do check out. They are carved in stones are the postal envelopes and the horns, which of course is not in the museum because it was not made into a post office. So, of course, your answer saying so is that we have to reimagine what was when we come to restoration from within. Because I did it as an employee of the Grand Department of Post, which is today more than 169 years old. And 5.5 lakh employees and 1,55,000 post offices. That is how we are relevant even today. Does that answer? I'm just a big proponent of my own department.
I think they both have said it.
I'll open the floor to any questions from the audiences if they would like to ask anything.
My name is Pratap. All the conservation architects, I have a big respect to them. But do we require so much money to be spent on the structures which are 100 plus years? Is there any pride we will be taking on that? Or we just want to restore and keep it as a monument where so many people are working underneath, which is having so much structural problems and everything?
So I went to an architecture college where Sanaya teaches, and I asked the young batch of young architects saying that, okay, and one architect had asked me this question saying, why should we look at conservation? And I just put the question to the audience, and I could do the same here, that name your 3 favorite buildings in the city of Mumbai. And I won't take more of your time, but what happened at that discussion is that everybody among the young 2nd year to 5th year architecture students named historic buildings of Bombay. They didn't come up with new buildings. So when you look around the city and I ask you this question, which building post-independence do you really love architecturally? I'm sure you're all going to struggle. And if I asked you, I'm sure there'll be buildings like Gateway of India, CSTM, BMC, Opera House, Prince of Wales Museum, all these buildings. So my point is, if you cannot build better buildings, maintain and conserve the ones that you have. And honestly, it doesn't take so much money. And when we talk of, like, what are we doing to our planet? Architecture and construction is a heavily resource-driven industry. It's a heavy polluting industry. And even for just sustainability of the planet, if we're able to extend the life of buildings, that is the greenest architecture possible.
May I add, sir, when you say that, I can say for about my GPU, it's going to stand for 100 more years. Can you really talk about any other building that will do? Yeah. No, thank you. No, it's not dissolute. It will stay like Abha says. This building will again stay 100 years more. So sustainability, that's the modern, buzzword. SDG goals. Why not do that? Why discard something that's almost perfect? And remember, I can tell you about my post people. And today I sit in a swanky Cuff Parade building that people say it's great, World Trade Center. Nothing in comparison to the palace room that I used to sit in. And my postmen today tell, we want to stay back because hum to kholi mein rehte hain. You see, that's the pride. You're giving them the best. Why do you want to undo the best?
Yes. So I want to ask, as we learned from your talk, that all the great power, including the British colonial masters, they make the building not for the building, but they wanted to make a statement, a power statement. Now, even from the Indo-Saracenic and they went to Gothic. They didn't want to stuck up to the classical architecture. Now, when the Indian government wanted to make a government buildings, kacheri, new parliament, what type of idea they have? Or they are stuck with all this type of historical architecture, or because the Mughal they don't want to own they don't want to give anything in the Mughal. So what the new parliament will say, or any other architecture the Indian government make, does it make a statement or no statement? Or does it make a republic statement that we are Indian Republic? Is it saying from the architecture? That is how I wanted to know.
That's a very interesting question, but I think you've answered your own self, and I'm just glad I'm not the architect who has to defend the design of the parliament, so I'll leave that to him.
See, all public architecture has a political or ideological, cultural background to it. We must accept that, right? But having said that, everything that then gets built, in historical periods or in contemporary periods becomes part of our architectural history, the journey of architectural history. If you see, therefore, like your question is about the new parliament building in New Delhi. That has also come a full circle actually, because kind of wanting to gel with the Lutyens New Delhi that Abha talked about, Edwin Lutyens architecture in New Delhi, right? And that full circle that traverses over there. But we are straying from our topic of Indo-Saracenic, right? And Indo-Saracenic in its age, when that got built, right? it definitely kind of made a statement of power on the part of the Raj. But at the same time, it also incorporated in the most delightful, most whimsical manner, elements from India's past. They came together in a manner that never existed in the original buildings, right? So it is a hybrid style. It is a mixture. It is also an overlay, as I said, on neo-Gothic, particularly in Bombay, because in Bombay neo-Gothic never kind of faded. It slowly kind of went into Indo-Saracenic, but retained its Gothicness. So now, today, when in 2026, when we are sitting, we have to see that as one of the story of a part of the story of India's architecture, right? And Bombay is a living laboratory of Indian architecture, as you have mentioned in your introductory note. So, such a whimsical, delightful, kind of almost crazy sort of mix in architecture. I don't think we will see in any other period, and that delights us today. It links with the memory of the people of the city, right? And provides us with something to be happy and proud with. The institutions like the museum and the post office are also locations for people to come and meet and engage in several cultural activities, right? So for all these reasons, we must understand the perspective about what you asked or what you have asked.
Yeah.
There are other questions, please.
So I have two questions. One is from Swati and the other is from Abha. So Swati, you speak very passionately about the challenges you face. Although you're a civil servant, your architectural knowledge is so good.
I don't like the although.
I'm just remembering the Mumbai Literature Festival, where you spoke so passionately about that's why the although, because that was so good. And my question to you is, you briefly mentioned about the comparison of Mumbai GPO with Kolkata GPO. So can you just speak a little more about it, maybe with other GPOs of other cities, some sort of comparison in terms of the architectural language of the GPOs? Because Pune GPO is also very interesting. As everywhere I go, I always get fascinated with 40001, and then in Pune it is 41101. So that whole thing has its own charm. I'll put both the questions and then you can take. And the question for Abha is, when you asked what are your three favorite buildings, my three favorite buildings happen to be Taj, which is Indo-Saracenic, and the other two were Regal Cinema, which is Art Deco, and the third one is Capital Cinema. I don't even know what is its architectural style. So is there any single screen cinema which was in Indo-Saracenic style which was lost in, which was just raised, like what's happening with most of the Art Deco single screen cinemas? So I want to know, is there a relation between Indo-Saracenic architecture which influenced the single screen cinema halls in India or in Mumbai specifically?
Why don't you answer your question first?
Yeah, okay. So, I answered to Sanaya that GPOs classically in the times of the Raj denoted power, economic power. And that's the most important kind of power, when you have the money source, that's the mother lode. So each GPO also resonated the time period of the British Raj or the East India Company or, henceforth. And that is what its reflection. So it brought out something that they were proud of, and they thought it made a statement among the Praja, the common class that actually did business. So, Kolkata GPO, which is the first GPO of the country, was a Victorian style, because that is what Kolkata was all about, right? Before the Raj moved in 1911 to Delhi, it was all Victorian, classical. So you have this Corinthian and Doric columns in the Kolkata GPO, a white building. It completely looks that you have translocated it from England and you've put it in the Maidan area of Kolkata. It has nothing to do with the spirit of Kolkata. It had nothing to do with even Bengal Renaissance, you know. There was no, and Bengal had its own architectural style. So this was just an alien architectural style that came in to denote power, to denote that we have the authority. Mumbai, like all of us have been talking about, it was something quietly comforting also. This was the time that not only it talked about glory, it also talked about a legitimate ruler, but also something that gave you comfort. Because when you see the Indian elements, chhatris, you know, the pergolas, the cupolas, you feel comfortable. And here it was also a structure that the common man went and did business. So you could not have something very alien. And the time period of Mumbai GPO. Hence, Pune GPO, you have to see everything in a time period. It reflected the sentiment the country was going. It was not just the Raj's sentiment. Of course, the money came from the Raj for all GPOs, but it was also the national movements that happened, you know. So each GPO reflected the sentiment of the people also. Hence, you would see, like you told me, the Chennai GPO is again a complete, you know, Victorian style building. Nothing Indian. Because that was, the sentiment was not of a national movement. So I would say Mumbai was something that they had to buckle to, and they knew that they could not get in a Victorian structure in 1904 anymore.
Abha?
Does that answer? Yeah.
So again, to answer politically, these buildings come after Queen Victoria's dead and gone. So with her then goes out the Victorian Gothic style. And then you have, just before the Edwardian style, there's this little hiccup in history between the two styles where Indo-Saracenic comes right in the middle. And that's why when we see the Mumbai Victorian Art Deco precinct, one side you have the Victorian Gothic, the other side you have the 20th century Art Deco, and literally wedged between these two styles is the Western Railway headquarters, which is a supremely Indo-Saracenic building. Pretty much the intergeneration between these two styles. And one more, which we didn't mention, is one more typology of architecture, which is very interesting, which is across India that you'll see a lot of Indo-Saracenic or various regional styles cropping up are railway stations. Because again, railway stations come in that period after the mutiny or the first war of independence, and then, you know, complete establishment of the British Raj, where you have the railway stations in Jodhpur, Jaipur, I mean small towns, principalities, as well as the railway stations of Purani Delhi, of Chennai, of Lucknow, and the larger cities, all mostly in various flavors of the Indo-Saracenic. So I'd say that. And when you spoke about the second question about theatres, is we have to understand when we talk of single screen theatre, they are a much later genre. When with the coming of the cinema, you also have the coming of Art Deco. And that's why most of the single screen theatres are by design Art Deco, because that was in fashion and in vogue. And the ones before that, like Capitol and Opera House, are Beaux-Arts, where they're sort of classical revival, because that's theatre, that is performance theatres and operas, and not single screen film theatres, which are mostly Art Deco across India.
So we'll make that a topic for the next conversation, because Abha may have something to do with both those buildings. But anyway, thank you for this wonderful conversation. I was just thinking, you know, this whole competition and then the international architect winning the bid is kind of going on maybe now still. And, you know, I was also thinking that in this very room, 9 years ago, we did this talk, and I'm trying to pull it up on our website, is Building Bombay, the business families who built this city. And it's not just the Raj. And we did this in 2017. But thank you, Smita, Abha, and Swati for sharing your insights. It was a wonderful presentation. And Sanaya for so skillfully moderating the session as always. To our partners, the NGMA, Nidhi ji and Shruti, Intact, for being part of this. And to our audiences, you know, we're trying to take this series forward. I think the next one will be on neoclassic / Edwardian architectural styles. I think Mustansir is going to be our guide for the next one. everyone. And we will be back with our 6th episode of Uncovering Urban Legacies again in this very room, where we'll be looking at museums, mills, and the Back Bay reclamation. But before that, we have one straggling program which we had planned for Mumbai Climate Week, which is going to be on the 25th at the TIFR on inventing the future's India's climate innovation pathway. To find out more, I always say that, just stalk us on Instagram or follow us on our website. Thank you all for being here in such large numbers, and have a lovely evening.